The Warden. It was New Year's Eve, and I was working a shift for DoorDash, making a little extra cash delivering food. The night had been busy, mostly delivering to parties and families staying in for the night. The money was good, and as midnight neared, things were slowing down. Most people were already settling in for their celebrations. Around 11, I got an order for 6 pizzas and wings from a chain pizzeria. The address was a little out of the way, but it was a nice chunk of cash to end my night with. I figured it was a house party, given the amount of food. I picked up the food and got to the house around 11:30. Sure enough, a party was in full swing when I pulled up. The front porch was littered with empty beer cans, and the music was loud enough that I could hear it from the street. As I walked to the door, a guy with long curly hair and a thick beard, smelling like weed, greeted me. "Yo, you saved the party, man," he said, his smile wide and genuine. "Thank you for bringing the food." I chuckled. It wasn't like I was doing it out of the kindness of my heart. They had ordered it. The guy invited me inside to ring in the new year with them. I hesitated. He seemed friendly enough, but the whole thing was a little weird. Still, there were 2 cute girls standing nearby, beers in hand. They smiled and nodded, saying I should come in and hang out for a bit. How could I say no to that? I walked in, and the hippie guy handed me a beer. "You know," he said, leaning in with a wink, "there's other choices if you want something stronger, if you catch my drift." I politely declined. "Thanks, I'm good with the beer." The party was a weird mix of people. The 2 girls had an all-American college vibe. Across the room, there was a couple dressed in black, sitting next to a guy with a buzz cut wearing a Pokemon shirt who looked half-conscious. It was definitely an eclectic crowd. I started chatting with one of the girls, a cute brunette named Gracie. We flirted a little, and I asked if this was their house. She smiled and shook her head. "No, this is the Warden's house," she said, her tone strange. "The Warden?" I repeated, not sure what to make of that. Gracie and the other girl exchanged glances, then smiled. "Yeah, you should totally say hi to him." Something felt off, but Gracie took my hand and led me toward the stairs. At the bottom, a man and a woman who looked like accountants were chatting. A guy in a tie-dye t-shirt rocked back and forth on the stairs, muttering to himself. It was all starting to feel bizarre, but I was in too far now to back out. At the top of the stairs, the atmosphere changed entirely. The hallway was filled with people, some passed out, others shooting up. I began to regret agreeing to come inside, but Gracie kept a firm hold on my hand, leading me down the hall to a door at the end. She knocked lightly. "Enter," came a booming voice from inside. Gracie opened the door. Sitting there on a throne, and I mean a literal throne, in the middle of the room was a thin man with dreadlocks and a long, scraggly beard. His eyes were red, bright red. It took me a second to realize he was wearing red contacts. He wasn't just high, although he was out of it in a different type of way. People sat on the floor around him, gazing up at him like he was some kind of a prophet. A Rottweiler slept at his feet. "Gracie, my dear," the man boomed in a voice that rattled my bones. "Who is your friend?" "This is Paul," she said. "He brought us food." The warden grinned, revealing several missing teeth. "Lovely," he said. "And you've decided to stay for a sermon." A sermon? What the hell was he talking about? I was caught off guard. Everyone in the room was staring at me with eager eyes. I stammered a weak, "Thanks for having me." The warden laughed loudly. "Of course," he clapped his hands. "All are welcome who want to listen. All are welcome who want to grow." He started giving this bizarre, rambling speech filled with cryptic references and ominous warnings about the coming year. It was like a bad acid trip, with his eyes darting around the room and people nodding along like it made perfect sense. Gracie was practically hypnotized by his words, hanging on every syllable. Someone passed her a crack pipe. She took a hit and handed it to me. I passed it along without her even noticing. I glanced around the room, feeling more and more uneasy. The other partygoers were in a sort of a trance, and the room itself felt suffocating. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the warden announced it was time to go downstairs for the New Year's celebration. Gracie took my hand again and led me out of the room. The warden led us down the stairs where the rest of the party was spilling out into the backyard. The mood had shifted from weird to downright disturbing. The warden started chanting about the end of times and how we couldn't be taken if we gave ourselves over first. One of his minions started handing out red Solo cups filled with a clear liquid. Gracie let go of my hand to take her cup and moved closer to the warden, hanging on every word he said. I saw my chance. I slowed my pace, backing away as quietly as I could, and slipped into the shadows on the side of the house. Nobody was paying attention to me. I dumped the cup and bolted, running as fast as I could to the front yard. The only person still conscious out front was the hippie guy, who sat on the grass, barely aware of my escape. I jumped into my car, slamming the door behind me. I started the engine and peeled out of there, my heart pounding. As I drove down the road, fireworks exploded in the sky behind me, coming from the warden's backyard. I can't be sure, but I could have sworn I heard screaming carried on the wind. I didn't stop. I floored it and didn't look back. I spent the next few days trying to find out more about that night, but almost everything was a dead end. No one seemed to know much about the warden or the party, but after some more digging, I finally hit pay dirt. It turns out the warden, not his real name of course, had been in and out of jail since high school, arrested for everything from drug dealing to assault. But now, he'd graduated to cult leader. I'll never understand why anyone would follow that guy in the first place. And I don't know what happened to the other partygoers or what was in those cups. I'm just thankful I made it out of there. The final call. It was New Year's Eve 2016, and I was planning on keeping things simple. No parties, no friends, no distractions. Just me, my couch, and my TV. I'd been through enough over the past 2 months. June, my fiancée, had ended things in October, giving me the ring back with an apology and a heart full of regret. I wasn't even sure I believed her reasons anymore, but I had spent Thanksgiving and Christmas pretending to be okay for the sake of family, trying to navigate the sympathy and well-meaning hugs. But New Year's Eve was too much. It was the anniversary of the night I'd proposed. I knew I couldn't fake being happy that night. So I did what I always do when I'm hurt or lonely. I stayed in. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and I sipped my drink, staring blankly at the TV. The celebration was all around me, but I couldn't feel it. At 11 o'clock, my phone rang. I looked down at the name on my screen, and my heart stopped. It was June. I hadn't heard from her since the breakup. She'd gone completely radio silent, and I did the same, out of respect for both of us, or maybe out of fear. Seeing her name now, after 2 months, felt like a ghost from the past. I hesitated, and then answered. Hello? Static. Just static at first. I could barely make anything out, just a mix of crackles and muffled words. Then, faintly, I heard it. Her voice. Evan? I leaned in, my heart pounding in my chest. I could barely hear her over the interference, but I swore I caught a few other words. Trouble. Help. Love. Then the phone went dead. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it her? Was she calling from a bad connection? I couldn't think straight, my thoughts spinning as I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door. June lived on the other side of town. I floored it in my old Camry, praying that the cops wouldn't be out looking for New Year's Eve DUIs until after midnight. I needed to get there. I needed to find out what was wrong. I made it to her apartment in record time, my pulse racing. I ran up the steps and banged on the door. There was no answer. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. I ran around to the side of her apartment and jumped the railing onto her balcony. I peered through the glass doors into total darkness. My stomach dropped. She wasn't home. Why had I assumed she'd be home? It was New Year's Eve. She could be at a party or a bar or with friends or anywhere. She could even be out of town. I called her again. straight to voicemail, again and again. I felt panic rising in my chest, the static of the phone call still buzzing in my ears. Suddenly I heard sirens. Looking up, I saw a cop car pull into the parking lot. 2 officers stepped out. Before they could even speak, I blurted out everything. The phone call, the strange words, my worry that she was in trouble. They listened, their faces unreadable, letting me say it all without interruption. "Is that why you're here?" I asked. "Did she call 911? Do you know what's wrong?" They shook their heads. One of the officers spoke. "No, we're here because a neighbor reported someone trying to break into this apartment." They were talking about me, and I realized how crazy I must have looked to anyone in the neighboring apartments. I showed them the call log, told them June had called me just before 11 o'clock. The officers exchanged a look, then took down the information. "There's no sign of anything wrong here. We'll look into it, but we think it's just a misunderstanding. You should head home." I didn't argue. I couldn't. I was a mess. As I drove back home, fireworks lit up the sky, signaling midnight. My phone rang again. June. I answered immediately, my hand shaking. It was just static again. No voice, just the crackling of an empty line. "June! June, is that you?" I cried. But there was no response. Just more static, and then the phone went dead again. That was it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I wasn't going to let them tell me it was nothing. I turned the car around and headed straight for the police station. I had to show them this wasn't some coincidence. She was still trying to reach me. Something was wrong, and they needed to help. The officer behind the desk told me to take a seat. I waited for what felt like hours, the tension in my body building with each passing second. Finally, the officers I spoke to at her apartment entered the police station. I jumped to my feet. "Did you find her?" I asked, my voice cracking with anxiety. "Didn't we tell you to go home?" one of them replied, his tone cold. I explained the second phone call I'd gotten after they left. They exchanged another look, but this time they didn't say much. "Sit tight," one of them said. "We'll be with you shortly." I felt like I was losing my mind. As the night passed and the first light of dawn began creeping through the blinds, an officer finally came to get me. He led me to a room with a table and chairs and handed me a cup of coffee. "I'm sorry about the wait," he said. "We had to notify her next of kin first." The words hit me like a physical blow. My breath caught in my throat. I felt the room tilt. "June was in a car accident on the way to a New Year's Eve party," the officer continued. "She was in the back seat when a drunk driver hit their car. The EMTs got to her right away and revived her, but she flatlined again during surgery. The doctors couldn't bring her back a second time." My mind was spinning. The accident happened just before 11. She died during surgery right at midnight, the very moments I received the calls. The officer shrugged it off. "She must have had her phone in her hand, and the crash may have triggered a call." They couldn't explain the second call, though, the one that came when she was dying on an operating table. I stared at him, my hands shaking. There was no way this could be a coincidence. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe she was trying to reach out one last time, trying to let me know she still loved me before it was too late. Maybe that's a laughable idea, but it's the only one I have left. Since then, I've spent every other New Year's Eve alone, my phone at the ready, just in case she calls again. The right guy. It was New Year's Eve, and I was at a local bar with my best friends, ready to ring in the new year without any baggage. One of my friends had just gone through a tough breakup, so we'd made it our mission to make this a girls' night, all about fun, laughter, and zero drama. The place was packed with people celebrating, everyone in high spirits, and the energy was contagious. As we sipped our drinks and laughed about ridiculous stories from the past year, a guy approached me at the bar. He seemed friendly enough, and he smiled as he asked if he could buy me a drink. I politely declined. He seemed a little disappointed, but accepted graciously, wishing me a fun night, and walking away. I caught him looking my way a few times throughout the night, but it wasn't creepy, more like a casual glance, and I didn't think much of it. Besides, I was having a blast with my friends, and this was a night to forget about anything that weighed us down. Just before midnight, the bar handed out champagne flutes, and the countdown began. We all cheered, glasses clinking, the energy buzzing through the crowd. The guy from earlier came over again, not to offer me another drink, but just to wish me a happy new year. He clinked his glass with mine and smiled warmly before walking away. It was a nice gesture. No pressure, no weirdness. I felt oddly refreshed by that. It was rare for a guy to take a polite no without trying to push further. He seemed like a decent guy after all, and for a moment, I regretted not striking up a conversation with him. The night ended, and I Ubered home. I declined crashing at my friend's house because I needed to take my dog Max out. He was a German Shepherd, and though he was huge, he was the most loyal and loving dog I'd ever had. As the Uber pulled away, I walked to my front door. The street quiet, except for a single car that passed by slowly. It caught my eye for a moment, but it didn't stop. I thought nothing of it. Probably just someone being overly cautious, driving slow after a night of partying. I let Max out into the backyard. He sniffed around, doing his business. But as he started heading back to the door, he froze. His body went rigid, and he stared off into the shadows near the side of the house. I felt a chill creep up my spine. He let out a low growl, a sound that I rarely heard from him. I peered in the direction he was staring. Nothing. No movement. No reason for him to be acting this way. "Come on, Max," I said softly, trying to coax him back inside with a treat. He didn't budge. I took a few steps closer and snapped my fingers. He finally turned, but his eyes never left the corner of the yard. Relieved, I hurried inside and locked the door. It was probably just a fox or something in the neighbor's yard, I convinced myself, but I still couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Upstairs, Max curled up in my bed while I washed my face and got ready. The house was quiet again, but then a faint noise came from downstairs. Just a low thunk. Nothing loud. Max immediately went alert, growling again. I froze. Could it just be the house settling? A moment later, fireworks erupted outside. The neighbors were still celebrating, long after midnight. Max hated fireworks. He whined and cowered under the bed, and I tried to comfort him, though my own heart raced a little from the noise. Finally, after what felt like hours, the fireworks stopped, and Max settled down. He crawled back onto the bed, and eventually we both fell asleep. An hour or so later, I woke up with an intense thirst, cursing myself for not bringing up a bottle of water. I quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Max, and padded downstairs to the kitchen. As I closed the fridge door, a hand suddenly covered my mouth. Another arm wrapped tightly around my waist. "Don't scream," a voice hissed in my ear. "There's no need for anyone to get hurt." Panic surged through me. My mind scrambled for a way out, but I was paralyzed with fear. The intruder pulled me roughly out of the kitchen and into the living room, his grip on me tightening. I tried to break free, but he was too strong. As he navigated around a chair, his grip loosened just a bit. Without thinking, I stomped hard on his foot. He gasped in pain, and his hand briefly moved away from my mouth, just enough for me to scream. Before I could even take a full breath, he covered my mouth again, his hand pressing so tightly against my face I could barely breathe. "Shut up," he growled, shoving me back. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, heavy and fast, followed by an angry growl. Max. The man let go of me, but it was too late. Max was on him in an instant, his teeth sinking deep into the guy's arm. The force of Max's attack knocked the man to the ground, and he cried out in pain. Max wasn't letting go. I quickly dialed 911, my hands shaking. The line seemed to stretch on forever as I heard Max growling and the man's frantic pleas. Finally, the guy curled up in a ball, covering his face as Max stood over him, teeth bared. When the police arrived, they pulled the man to his feet, and that's when I finally saw him clearly. It was the guy from the bar, the one who had offered to buy me a drink. He had followed me home. I had thought he was a nice guy. I thought he'd respected my boundaries, accepted my polite no. But it turned out he had another plan all along. Max had stopped him before he could carry it out. As the police took him away, I felt a wave of relief. Max had saved me, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The man knew where I lived. He knew my routine. And if there was ever a next time, well, at least I'd have Max on my side. When all was said and done, it turned out I had spent New Year's Eve with the right guy, after all. The man at the bar. It was New Year's Eve, and my friends and I were at our usual spot, a little hole-in-the-wall pub we liked to frequent. It wasn't fancy by any means. Dimly lit, a jukebox in the corner, the kind of place where everyone knows your name. Most nights, the place was quiet, but on New Year's Eve, it was packed. Not as busy as the big clubs, but definitely more crowded than usual. We grabbed our drinks and started scanning the room, checking for any attractive women we could chat with. As I looked around, someone caught my eye. It was a man sitting by himself at the far end of the bar, nursing a drink in silence. He was older, maybe in his late 60s or even early 70s, and his face seemed vaguely familiar. I couldn't place where I'd seen him before, but I felt like I knew him. I shrugged it off at first. It was New Year's Eve after all, and I was looking to talk to women my own age, not an older guy. But after a while, curiosity started to get the better of me. I figured I'd go over, wish him a happy new year, and see if I did in fact know him from somewhere. When I got close, the man looked up at me. I smiled and wished him a happy new year. He smiled back, a slow and knowing smile. Happy New Year to you too, son. I hesitated for a moment, then asked, Do I know you? You look kind of familiar. The man shook his head. I don't think so. I've been coming here for years, though, so maybe you've just seen me around. I nodded, although that didn't seem right. My friends and I were there a lot and knew all the regulars. If he was a regular, I'd have recognized him straight away. I introduced myself, and he did the same. His name was Robert, and he told me he came to the pub every New Year's Eve. I lost my wife several years ago, he said, his voice quiet. I like to sit here until midnight. It beats being alone. I felt a pang of sympathy. I'm sorry to hear that. Robert smiled sadly and shrugged. I bought him a beer and returned to my friends. The night went on, the usual New Year's chaos unfolding all around us. I tried to enjoy myself, but I kept glancing over at Robert. The thing was, he never moved. Not once. He didn't get up to go to the bathroom. He didn't interact with anyone, not even the bartender. The beer I'd bought him sat untouched. He was still nursing that same drink he had when I first talked to him. I started to feel uneasy, but I couldn't figure out why. Eventually, the countdown began, and the energy in the pub shifted. People were laughing, counting along, and getting ready for the new year. I kept my eyes on Robert, thinking maybe I'd go talk to him after midnight and hear more of his story. When the countdown reached 5, I glanced over to see him, still sitting in the same spot, still as ever. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Everyone cheered, glasses clinked, and the sounds of celebration echoed through the pub. I looked back up at Robert, but he was gone. His seat was empty. I blinked, certain I had missed something. The beer I'd bought for him was still sitting on the counter, untouched, exactly where I'd left it. I walked over to his seat, my eyes scanning the room in confusion. No sign of Robert. I asked the bartender, someone who knew me and my friends pretty well from all our time there. Hey, have you seen the guy who was sitting here all night? The older man? The bartender gave me a confused look. What guy? He asked. I described Robert, told him about the beer I'd bought, the conversation we'd had. The bartender looked at me like I was crazy. Nobody's been sitting here all night, he said, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty chair. I glanced around the pub. Nobody seemed to have noticed anything strange. I turned back to the bartender, trying to make sense of it. Are you sure? He was right here. He was talking to me just a few minutes ago. The bartender shook his head, the puzzled expression still on his face. I don't know, man. There's been no one sitting at that end of the bar since before you walked in. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to make of it. Had I imagined the whole thing? Had I been too caught up in the New Year's Eve excitement to notice something strange? But there was one thing I just couldn't shake. The eerie feeling that maybe Robert had never really been there at all. And his seat? It remained empty for the rest of the night, the beer sitting there untouched, just like it had been all along. Happy New Year, and thanks for listening, friends. If you enjoyed these allegedly true, chilling New Year's Eve horror stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next year with more whispers from the pines.